Hello and welcome to the first installment of our four-parts webinar series regarding digital transformation and data-driven analytics. My name is Beatrice Bösiger. I am a journalist with Finanz und Wirtschaft. In the next 60 minutes, we will be discussing how data-driven applications can help HR professionals succeed in the war for talent and find the best candidates for their respective companies and the positions they have to fill. After working nearly 2 years under the conditions of a global pandemic, HR departments still face big challenges. For example, remote work has changed the way we work and interact, and this is also probably not going away for the foreseeable future. This is one of the reasons that companies are changing their ways of finding the best candidates for available positions. The challenge for them is also to keep the human factor in mind. With me to discuss how data-driven applications can help HR departments find the best heads in the market are Rickesh Patel. He is a Master Principal Solution Consultant with Oracle. He will be talking about how data can help and empower HR professionals in making the right decisions when it comes to recruiting. And also with us is Peter Kirchschläger. He is a professor of theological ethics and director of the Institute of Social Ethics at the Faculty of Theology of the University of Lucerne. One of his research focuses is ethics of digital transformation and of artificial intelligence. He will talk about the ethical aspects and questions those new recruiting solutions may get in touch with. Each of the two panelists will give a short 15-minute presentation. Afterwards, we will discuss some of the topics raised. I encourage you to submit your questions during the presentations. I will collect them and then we can discuss them afterwards during the Q&A session. You can post your questions simply by clicking on the Q&A button on your Zoom. And just a quick information, the webinar will be recorded and made available tomorrow on the homepage of Finanz und Wirtschaft. That's www.fuw.ch. Before we start, I would like to take a quick look at our survey. I asked you, has data-driven analytics significant potential to change how HR professionals work? 17% said yes, and that's why we already employ data-driven analytics solutions in our daily work. 67% said data-driven analytics has significant potential, but there are still a lot of open questions. For example, regarding privacy and data protection. 8% said data-driven analytics will have limited implications for the way HR professionals work. It is still people who matter the most. And also 8% said the use of data-driven analytics has no significant potential to change how HR professionals work. But now over to Rickesh Patel, who will be giving us some examples of how data-driven analytics can help companies in enhancing their visibility and also their planning. Mr. Patel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Rickesh Patel. I work with Oracle in our solution engineering team. And I want to talk to you today about specifically how you can use HR and analytics to really drive more strategic decision-making. And I wanted to start by actually talking about how we see data and analytics used in our everyday lives. Oracle actually recently announced some very interesting sports-related partnerships for you sports fans out there. So one of those partnerships is with the Formula One team Red Bull Racing, where we announced a partnership with them where they're using a lot of our technologies and our infrastructure to really drive the decision-making that they need to make. Now, if any of you have even a small knowledge of F1, you'll know that data is incredibly important from a Formula One perspective. the smallest amount of information can give you a small millisecond advantage, which can mean the difference between winning a race and coming in 5th place or 10th place or even further back than that. And F1 teams need to be able to make these decisions and make split-second changes to their decisions during a race while their drivers are driving around at hundreds of miles an hour. And so they have a real need to understand data, analyze it, and quickly make decisions based on that. And another area where we've also announced a partnership recently is for any of you that watch the English Premier League. Now, when you're watching a game, you can actually get live insights during that game. So things like, what's the threat of an attack happening in the next few minutes, or what's the likelihood of a particular player scoring in the next few minutes. Now, all of this, again, is based on data, based on thousands of data points about all of the players in the league, all of their past history, how they performed in different conditions, the conditions of the game, and we're providing the viewers with insight that helps make the game even more interesting and keeps you even closer to the edge of your seat as you're watching. Now, you're probably wondering at this point, well, what does F1 and the Premier League have to do with HR? But it's really about data and understanding what's happening, whether it's an F1 team deciding when to pit stop, or whether it's telling you when a particular player is likely to score based on everything else that's happening around them. And as HR professionals, being able to gain that insight and plan accordingly around that insight that's being given to you is really key, because it helps you then move from being a transactional, just understanding what's happening with my business today, to actually being able to look at, well, where might my business be going tomorrow? What are some of the trends that we're spotting, but spotting them early enough to actually be able to impact them? And how can we really drive change in our business and move to whatever our desires are in terms of a new way of working within our organization? So being able to use data to help drive that decision making is really, really important and really helpful. So I want to show you an example today of how, using Oracle, we can ask a question of some data and then start to really analyze it and understand it. So to do that, I'm going to show you what we call our Fusion Analytics warehouse. So this is our reporting tool where our users can go, they can run reports, they can find information. And this probably looks quite familiar to many of you. It might be set up in a different way, or it might look a different way, but I've got all of the types of reports that I'm familiar with looking at here. So things like, what's my head count? What's my retention? What's my diversity in terms of gender ratio? How many hires have I got? It's giving me the information I need based on what's happening in my business. But let's say I want to dig a little further than that. I actually want to ask a question of the data, and I want to understand it a little bit better. So through here, I can actually start to ask questions of data. Now, I've got a very common problem that many of you may have in your own organizations. Let's say I've identified as an HR business partner that we've got a number of unfilled positions in my organization. I'm not sure exactly how much. So the first thing I want to do is understand, well, how many unfilled positions do we have? And this is great. I've typed in unfilled positions and it's told me that there's 3,000 unfilled positions. But that's just giving me a number. It's not really giving me any understanding about, well, what's happening behind that. So, I work for a global organization. So I want to see, well, let's look at this by country and let's see if there's trends by country. Are there particular geographies that I need to focus on here? And I can see that the darker colors, they represent where we've got a high proportion of unfilled positions, and the slightly lighter colors are where we've got slightly less. So I can see, there are potentially a number of areas where we've got higher unfilled positions than others, but there is a general problem we've got here across Europe. Now, it's nice to know, that's great, I can see where these things are, but I want to start really understanding, is this just a one-off? Maybe we've got some expansion plans, so we've created some new vacancies because of that. Maybe we've recently had people moving around, so it's because of that. So let's see if it's a trend. And again, I just type in month and it understands, right, when I say month, I'm clearly looking to analyze this data, but on a timeline basis. And now it's given me this nice chart here, and I can see clearly we definitely have an upwards trend, or what looks to be an upward trend there. We were pretty stable for a while, but it seems to be going up quite a lot. So I definitely think I want to look at this a bit further and start to analyze it a bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into this chart and I'm going to start to analyze it a bit further and start to really understand what's happening here. So the first thing I want to do is I actually want to add a trend line to this. I want to just make sure that, because we've got lots of peaks and troughs, is this definitely an upward trend? And I can see clearly it is a very clear upward trend, even with the large jumps up and down there. And now I can start to use some of the power of this analytics and really start to say, right, well, let's extrapolate this out a bit. Let's actually create a forecast. And this is by default, it said it's 3 months, but maybe I want to change that and actually make it 6 months into the future. So now this is giving me some data that I could go to my HR director or some of my senior leaders with and say, look, we need to do something about this because there's going to be a trend here. We can see that it's going upwards and we've predicted that that's going to continue. But before I share this with somebody, I want to analyze it a bit further. I want to make it a bit easier to understand. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to put a bit of a narrative to go alongside this. So when somebody looks at this, they can very quickly understand, what is it telling me? What does this graph mean? Now, some of you, any of you that have maybe created analytics before or shared them within your business, you'll understand that it's all well and good sending a graph like this, but sometimes you need to put a narrative together. However, I haven't had to write this. With just a couple of clicks, the analytics tool has understood my chart and it's put that into words for me. So if I share this with one of my senior leaders, of course, they can look at the chart themselves and they can also start to understand actually, what are some of the key points that we need to understand about this. But I want to go a step further here. I actually want to, before I share this with anybody, I want to start to understand, well, maybe what are some of the reasons that this is happening? Is there something in particular happening that's making these positions be vacant? So I'm going to put that in as a filter there. I'm just going to turn it into a little tag cloud. So now we can see these are the main reasons for us having vacant positions. It's no-shows on the first day, i.e. we create a position, we go out there to hire somebody, an offer gets accepted and they don't turn up. And I can click on that and now it's going to show me the chart, but it's going to filter it by that particular metric. And I can see actually that, that's actually a downward trend. So we've got more people turning up and actually starting on the first day. So maybe it's new positions that have been created for some of the plans that we've got that we haven't yet filled. And I can see there's definitely a trend there. So, maybe it's not a huge amount to worry about, but the one I want to have a look at here is voluntary levers. Have we got people in our organization that are, leaving? And of course, we expect a level of attrition. We expect some people to leave, but this is maybe slightly higher than I would have expected. And I can see there's definitely an upward trend in predicted to leave. So now the last thing I want to do is actually apply a bit of AI to this. And let's look at our data, let's look at our people, and let's let the machine learning model suggest where there may be areas we want to look. Now, this isn't telling us that this is definitely going to happen, but what we've done is we've used the machine learning model to suggest where we might want to focus our attention. And I can see it starts by giving me a summary here to say that we'd expect around a 25% retention rate, which is possibly higher than what we would like given the type of organization we are. And maybe we want to keep that a bit lower. So let's analyze this a bit further. Let's start to understand, based on what the data is telling us, where are we likely to lose people? What are some of the driving factors that are likely to make people to leave? And I can see performance has been pulled out as a key metric. And we'd expect some of our core talent to leave. We'd expect some of our underperformers potentially to leave. Maybe they're not fitting in. And those we've identified as future leaders, we're fairly low there. So I'm actually not too worried about that one. Interestingly, the machine learning model, by analyzing our data and looking at it, has pulled out that married people are less likely to leave than single people. So, again, maybe you'd expect that. But what's really interesting here is actually it's telling me, based on the work locations of the people in our organization, there seems to be quite a serious problem with our warehouse staff. Now, that's something that I can actually look at and say, right, maybe we need to focus on those warehouse staff and find out what's causing issue. So that's going to allow me to drill even further. But there's also other information here. Like I can see, for example, our analysts, again, they seem to be at risk, relative to the other types of job role we have. And our employees based in France, again, there seems to be a higher risk there. So this has used that model to analyze the data within our organization and tell me from, just wanting to understand how many unfilled positions we have, to actually being able to analyze the data, understand what's happening, and start to put together an action plan to reduce some of those issues that we found with voluntary redundancy. So hopefully that's been a nice quick summary for you to help you understand how you can use the Oracle tools or analytics tools in general to start to analyze and understand what's happening with your business. So with that, I'll pass back over to Beatrice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interesting insights, Mr. Patel. And now Peter Kirchschläger will tell us more about the ethical questions that arise because of these new recruiting methods. A quick reminder, if you have any questions for one of the two panelists, please post them in your Q&A sections in your Zoom. Mr. Kirchschläger, the mic is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Bösiger. And I'm really honored and glad to be here today. And thanks so much for having me. And also thank you for your kind introduction. I'll just share my slides with you. So I'm looking forward to discuss with you today some ethical aspects of data-driven analytics in the area of HR. And I would like to start with some fundamental reflections on the use of data. All this is based on my newest book on digital transformation ethics, which just was published this year. And so you have like the enjoyment of newest research results presented to you in 15 minutes. So basically, I would like to start with the fundamental reflection of the potential of database systems and so-called artificial intelligence, mainly emphasizing the fact that it's all about data and it's all about just data. So what I would like to invite you is to reflect more critically the term, for example, which are used in this area, for example, the term artificial intelligence, due to the fact that we are not really confronted by real intelligence, but rather by database systems. Because if we look at what our so-called artificial intelligence is able to do, we are realizing that so-called artificial intelligence is surpassing us humans in the use of a huge amount of big data. It's surpassing our intelligence in memory, in logical deduction. But there are certain areas of intelligence, of human intelligence, which are not reachable for so-called artificial intelligence. For example, the area of moral capability, so being able to act as a moral subject. Also the area of emotional intelligence, where we could see though that the AI is able to simulate human emotions. We wouldn't call them real emotions. And also the area of social intelligence, which of course have an impact in the area of HR, where we also can say that AI is striving for perfection in simulating social intelligence of humans, but it's not able to really reach the same level as humans due to the lack of authenticity. So when AI tries to behave socially or tries to be emotional, it's not authentic. And that's here the main difference, which still remains between humans and machines. And therefore, I would invite you to use the term database system instead of the term artificial intelligence, because the term database systems is more precise in describing what is actually happening, what is actually the case, namely the collection, the generation, the analysis of huge amount of data. As I said, it's all about data, it's just data. Now, looking more specifically in the area of data-driven analytics, we can identify the following ethical problems. On one hand, and I am sure that Mr. Patel would agree with me, that data-driven analytics in the field of HR go further than what he was just giving you as an example. So that I think the use of data in analytics for HR does not stop there, but rather goes further and can embrace also violations of human rights to privacy and to data protection. If you may think, well, but the business opportunity is so big that we don't care about privacy and data protection anymore, I just wanted to remind you that actually what is at stake when we are violating the human rights to privacy and the human rights to data protection is freedom, is our liberty. And we have struggled as humanity for centuries to have these rights in place. And I would invite you not to give them up too quickly for some short-term business opportunities. The other ethical aspect linked with that is the issue of surveillance. So is a company entitled legally and also, of course, ethically to surveil its employees? Well, from an ethical perspective, the response is clear: no, that's not legitimate. Another issue is, and we could understand that also from a very human perspective, we humans tend to love simple and easy and clear responses in complex times, in complex realities. So we love to see some graphs who are indicating us very clearly, very specifically where the problems are, where the challenges are, so we can master them and meet them. But in reality, these graphs, this data is not objective, it's not neutral, but it's very much depending how we frame the analysis of this data. So summarizing that ethical aspect, data is telling you what you're telling data to tell you. So basically, it's important to see that how we frame the analysis of data is decisive and is fundamental and is key in this area. And therefore, we shouldn't approach data-driven analytics with the high and too high expectations to say, well, we expect some objectivity, some neutrality. That's definitely not the case. And also linked with that is the issue of the ethical issue of bias and discrimination. If you look at which data is collected and then analyzed, and if you look at how the analysis of that data is framed, we run the risks that biases and discrimination is happening and is part of this use of data. Furthermore, dealing with database systems in general, but also specifically in the area of data-driven analytics in the field of HR, we have to face the challenge of lack of explainability and responsibility. So if database systems give me a very specific advice in the area or a very specific result in the area of HR, humans dealing with these results cannot understand why we get this result. And we are not even able to identify subjects of responsibility. So we are not able to identify who is actually responsible to give us for providing us this result. In a case of a mistake, in a case of an error which leads them to harsh consequences for humans, we don't have the possibility to identify the subject of responsibility, so the one who is responsible for that mistake, which would be though ethically necessary in order to be able to hold someone accountable, not just for the victim and but also for doing justice. In addition, we have to deal with the ethical problem of lack of authenticity. So what we actually experiencing in reality is authentic. What is only based on data as an analysis and created as kind of an additional reality is not authentic. And often we are not able as humans to differentiate between the two. A more fundamental issue with database systems in general, but also in the area of data-driven analytics in HR, is that we have to deal with the challenge of unequal access to the positive potentials of database systems. So who is actually in the advantage, who is actually in the position of advantage to be able actually to use these database systems? And finally, I would like to close my presentation with a remark which brings us back into the circle with what I just have started my input. We can finally identify as a fundamental ethical issue in the area of data-driven analytics of HR, the misleading reduction of complexity of the reality. So basically we are living as humans in a complex reality. We are as humans able to cope, we are able to live with that, and we run the risk with data-driven analytics in the area of HR that we actually reduce this complexity of the reality in a misleading way, which is actually not making our decisions in the field of HR more intelligent, but rather we run the risk to make them more stupid. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion with you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Kirchschläger. I think you have given us much food for thought and for discussion. Now I would like to open the floor for your questions. Again, if you have some of them, please keep them coming and post them in your Zoom. Mr. Patel, I would like to start with you. It's a common conception that HR is still a people's business. I would start with a little reality check from you. When I apply for a job at a company, how likely is it that an algorithm is involved in the process, and where is it most likely to be employed?
Yeah, good question. So yes, it is very likely that algorithms are involved in some way when you apply for a job and apply for a role, and it can be in lots of different ways. I think the place we see it most commonly will be when you are having a recommendation made to a recruiter. So a recruiter's got a list of 100, maybe 1,000 candidates, and they're trying to sort and filter who are the best candidates for that role. And in its simplest form, and this has been around for years and years, it would be an algorithm that will say, well, we asked you to fill out 10 questions in your application form based on your experience and your work history and your education, and we've given you a score based on that, and it will rank you, and that will be an algorithm. Now, what we're starting to see more of now, and a lot more organizations are starting to deploy, is actual true AI when we are analyzing candidates. So rather than it just being the results of a test you do or the results of an application you fill out, an AI is actually able to look at the candidates. It's able to say, well, okay, we know that fine, this person scored X or Y against the job, but actually, what are the parameters outside of just what we're asking for? So if we compare this candidate to maybe people that work for us already, how does that person's profile compare? So not only do you have the right skills, but are you going to be a successful employee? So that's where we're starting to see a lot more AI involved in the recruitment process. But yeah, I mean, there are some organizations out there. I work with a lot of retailers where they even employ algorithms before you've even applied for a job. So they personalize the careers website for you. So yeah, it's a lot, I would say.
And who is making the final decision?
Well, for the most part, everybody I talk to, it's still a person that will make that final decision. So the AI is really there to simplify the process. So to help your recruiters focus on the candidates that are a good fit. And rather than focusing on the 50 candidates or the 1,000 candidates, you can focus on the 10 or 15 to see which ones are a good fit and then say, okay, now I've got my shortlist, I'll work with those.
Mr. Kirchschläger, are you surprised when you hear Mr. Patel talk about that?
No, no, I'm not really surprised. I'm rather concerned because what I find interesting is and I'd say ethically problematic now is that for example, in the process of recruitment, you actually can tell now, thanks to the statement by Mr. Patel, how the complexity of the reality is actually reduced, because you're actually framing with the questions you give in a questionnaire people beforehand to answer. And of course, they cannot answer them, 10 pages, but they rather have to be summarizing what they thought or their input on these questions. You're actually reducing complexity and you're reducing the reality. So basically, you run the risk that you actually would love to make a more intelligent decision, but at the end of the day, you make a more stupid decision because you're not allowing people to shine as they could shine in the recruitment process. And the other thing which is concerning me is, of course, when you said, well, it's still a person, so we are running into a reality where most of these decisions will be made by database systems if you're not doing something about it. And that's, of course, of bigger concern to me, because then we really run to be trapped into decision-making processes by database systems, which we have framed, but we still have the impression that they would be objective and neutral, which they are not, because they are framed and programmed and trained by humans.
About the questions about the rise from training the algorithms and possible biases, I would like to talk a little bit later about this. But next, I have a question from the audience that goes to Mr. Patel, and somebody wants to know a little bit more about these trend charts you showed us. What do they have to do with proper HR or selection of the right person for my company? So a very praxis-oriented, concrete question.
Of course, yeah. So, I mean, obviously we just gave one example of how you might use a report, but I think trending in general is important. Not necessarily in day-to-day HR, but it's important to help you understand what's happening with my business, to help you spot issues in the early days, rather than waiting for a problem where, actually we've got a huge retention issue. Maybe it's because of we're not paying our people enough compared to the market. Maybe it's because of sentiment and, we've got a lot of unhappy employees. But if we don't use trending, then we only find those things out when they become an issue. So when those people have already left because we're not paying them enough, or when those people have already filled out their survey, 5 times and said, I hate working here, and then decided to leave. So really the trending is about helping you understand and look into the future. And it's obviously something that you could do manually with lots and lots of data. But what the reports are helping you to do is take lots and lots of data points and show you how that would extrapolate out. Again, we as people understand factors that can happen outside of a piece of technology telling you what a trend is that are going to impact that. So that's the trending piece. From how is it going to help me find the best person for my business? The example we used was more focused on retention risk. Now, of course, and we talked a little bit about it in the last question around AI and algorithms to help you find help you find the best candidates, or help you find the best employees, or potentially the best employees. So that's where a different type of reporting comes in. And that's more kind of proactive reporting. So rather than me running a report like we did when I created it there, it would actually be a system as part of the recruitment process prompting me and saying, so you've had 100 candidates apply, here are 10 for you to look at. So it's still reporting and analytics, but it's kind of presented to you as part of a process rather than me going and saying, I want to run a report to find who the best candidates are.
Okay, thank you very much. So now I would like to talk a little bit about the issue of bias that has already come up in Mr. Kirchschläger's presentation. I think for that is not going to happen. The quality of data is very important. And how can companies ensure that they don't end up with a biased algorithm? Maybe can you elaborate a little bit on that, Mr. Patel? And then Mr. Kirchschläger, I would like you to weigh in. How can companies, in your opinion, set up more ethical algorithm, if that's possible?
Sure. Okay. So it's actually a question I get asked quite a lot when I'm speaking to new potential Oracle customers looking at moving to a cloud-based solution where they might be employing AI, especially in recruitment. And they'll ask, so how can you ensure that your engine to recommend candidates is unbiased? And the reality is the algorithm isn't biased or unbiased. It's using your data. So and there's different, without getting too technical with it, there are different ways you can train the model. So in Oracle's case, we deliver our recruitment AI model pre-trained. So it's trained based on there's like a European standard data set, and there's a US one, and we train it based on that in terms of what makes a strong candidate, what makes somebody fit well in a role. But really, these tools become powerful when you start to apply them to your own organization, and it starts to look at, right, well, within our organization, what's the profile of somebody that's a good fit, and what's somebody that's going to thrive in our business. Now, there isn't a silver bullet answer to this. If your organization has a bias and it has a certain profile of person, whether that's age, ethnicity, gender, whatever that is, probably a combination of all of those things, then the algorithm will only learn based on that. So it will think that the type of person who is successful in your organization fits that profile. So the only way for you to really use the algorithm effectively is it has to be alongside proactive measures that are physically taken by your people to say, we are going to make sure that we are removing this bias from our organization. And we will then train the algorithm based on that, rather than training on all of our historic data, which maybe doesn't fit with that. So the algorithm doesn't make you biased or unbiased. It just uses the information that's there. And if, as is often the case, if it is inherently biased, then you're going to pick up on that.
Mr. Kirchschläger, somebody from the audience has the question that I would like to ask you. Humans are neither objective or neutral. How should we teach machines to be? I think that would fit nicely in this segment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. And I think it's perfectly linking also with the closing of Mr. Patel's statement. So I think the big challenge here is that we as humans are perceiving algorithms and database systems as objective and as neutral, and which they cannot be, because we humans train them, we program them, we run the data, we frame how the data analysis is done. And there, all the biases we actually have ourselves flow into these processes. And I think what makes it more difficult for us humans in the perception is that if a human makes a judgment, we are aware of the fact that it can be a subjective judgment, it can be biased, it can be discriminatory. But in the case of an algorithm, in the case of a database system, we expect too much from it. We expect that this would be a neutral and objective response. We get objective results. So I think one starting point in order to create an ethically acceptable way of using data and data-driven analytics in HR is actually to change our perception of the tools we have in hand, thanks to data-based technological progress. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not against data use in general or in an absolute way. I'm just, from an ethical point of view, I would ask for a purpose-bound, a purpose-driven use of data, so that we not just randomly collect all the data we can in the framework now of digital transformation and the use of database systems, but that we rather focus on the data we need for a specific purpose, and that we ask people if they are willing to give us the data we need for that specific purpose, with the limitation that this data is just used for this specific purpose. I'll give you an example. If I go to a physician, because I have, in the case of a health issue, I share with that physician very personal data of myself. And that's not an ethical issue at all, because we both have the agreement, and of course the physician is also legally bound, to not share that data with the one who gives him more or her the most money for this personal data of mine. Now, in the case of machine learning, database systems, digital transformation, we are actually doing that. So the physician would sell that data to the one who gives the most for this data, so basically to health insurance companies, etc. And that's my point here. I would like to invite us to use data, but data like in database systems, but purpose-bound and purpose-driven, and not just for the economic exploitation of these personal data sets. Thank you.
Would you like to add something, Mr. Patel, to that?
No, I mean, I guess as the data person, I completely agree with you. I think it's how data is used, and it's using it in the right way, and not collecting it for the sake of collecting it. Is what you're saying, and I think I'd absolutely agree with that.
The next question from the audience is also tackling the issue of data collection and of privacy. Somebody would like to know from Mr. Kirchschläger, how is the regulation in Switzerland on analyzing data for HR purposes? Is it more strict than in other countries or less? And you told me when we talked together last week that you don't want new laws in this area, but the existing ones should be better applied. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? And maybe also Mr. Patel can tell us a little bit how is it in Great Britain and in the EU?
Well, thank you so much for this question. I think in Switzerland we have a quite liberal situation in that regard for the use of data in the area of HR compared internationally. And linking that with our conversation we had last week on what needs to be done about the human rights violations of the human right to privacy and the human right to data protection. My point here is that we have actually these human rights in place. So we have actually legally binding norms in place. Where I see the problem is not that we don't have these norms, but rather that we're not enforcing them in this area strictly enough. So what I would call for is not new regulation, but rather to respect and implement the legal norms we actually have. So we as humans are entitled with the human right to privacy and the human right to data protection. So actually to be protected that our employer cannot surveil us and by that actually violate our human rights and our human dignity.
And how is it in Europe and Great Britain?
So obviously I'm not as much of an expert on the subject as Mr. Kirchschläger, but I can certainly give you my view on it. And in terms of legally, we have relatively good protections in terms of, you're only allowed to store data as long as it's relevant and as long as you need to. So on paper, you're very well protected in the UK and EU. I think the reality of it, certainly if we think of from an HR standpoint and an employer standpoint, it's very easy to justify on needing to store data about somebody. An example I often hear is, let's say I'd left an organization, and you'd assume, well, if I've left an organization, why do they need to keep data on me? But it's very easy to argue, well, if a company were to get sued 10 years from now, they need to know that I've completed a training. At that time, I had completed a training course. So we need to keep your data for that. So there are protections in place, but they probably don't go far enough, because I think they're very easy to circumvent, and they're very easy to get around. So really proving the need for data is very difficult. It's very difficult to say one way or another, do you actually have to keep this data about me? Is it useful for you? Is it going to provide me with anything other than you just, targeting me or, potentially using it against me in some way?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. And now I have a question that is maybe interesting for the HR professionals that are listening. If they think about implementing such a project in their own organizations, how do you have any tips, Mr. Patel? How should they proceed?
Yeah, so I mean, if I guess on the topic of kind of data and bias and so on, I think it's important to really think about the quality of your data when you're starting on a new analytics project from an HR standpoint. I speak to a lot of customers which will say, we have all of these reporting tools, but to be honest, we don't really trust them, because one day I might look at it and it will tell me I have 10,000 employees. Another day I run a report with slightly different parameters and it tells me I have 30,000. So I think when you're embarking on projects like this, I think it's important to start with data cleansing and making sure that the quality of the information that you're collecting and using is there from day one. And I think that can make a real difference in getting success out of these tools.
Okay, and Mr. Kirchschläger, what would you suggest for an organization who wants to embark on digital transformation?
Well, I think what I would recommend is to make sure that you get aware of the fact that digital transformation is not yet there where we would like to have it to be there. So basically what I'm trying to say here is that with the example now by Mr. Patel, quality of data, I think it's not just an issue of quality of data, it's also an issue how which parameters you set, and also the quality of the parameter setting. It's also that we still have like technical problems with dealing with big data. So that, for example, correlations and causal relations can be mixed up. Like things like which are really technical can still make it hard to get to a specific and very precise result, although we have, by using these tools, the impression that they are objective and neutral and perfect. So I would invite to caution in that regard. I think we should proceed that road, but we need to do that in a human rights respectful way. So I'm calling for human rights-based database systems. So the use of database systems which are though respecting human rights and including the human right to privacy and data protection, in order to avoid these human rights violations on this path. And also more specifically, this aspect of purpose-bound and purpose-driven use of data already when you start to use these tools. Thank you.
And thank you very much. So all these systems are, of course, relatively new, and many of these, they run in the background. We don't get to know them every day. What is your opinion, you both? do the people get the ethical dimension of digital transformation, and do you see education happening, or is there still a long way to go? Maybe Mr. Kirchschläger and then Mr. Patel.
Well, thank you so much for your question. I think that the interest in the ethical questions, in the ethical opportunities, but also in the ethical risks is extremely high. And this interest, though, has to deal with huge economic pressure to just push that technological-based progress further as fast as possible. And I think a lot of people find themselves in this difficult conflict between they kind of understand, they realize that something ethically problematic is happening, is going on, but at the same time, there's a lot of push for more efficiency and of economic exploitation of these possibilities, being aware at the same time, though, that it can be highly problematic from an ethical point of view. And there, I think it would be not so much not only the responsibility of the single employees, but rather in the single humans, but rather in the individual persons, but rather also of organizations to take the lead in also discussing these issues and trying to find solutions together, and in order to create an environment where human rights-based database systems are the standard. You know, in the case of human rights, we are talking about a minimal standard. We are not talking about a higher ethical, ethos which would really be admirable we would be admired for us as humans, but rather it is really just realizing, implementing a very minimal standard who just makes sure that we as humans can survive and can live as humans with human dignity.
Yeah. So I would say, in terms of people actually understanding what's being done with their data, how much of it's being collected, and how it's being used, I actually think a lot of people have just become so used to it in their personal lives. It's just we don't really even think about it anymore. It's part of what we do. We're on various apps and search engines and social medias, and we're sharing so much of our information without really realizing the impact of what happens with it. So then in a business context, it almost seems, well, compared to how much a popular search engine knows about me, my employer probably knows far, far less. So I think the way that a lot of people almost balance it or justify it in their minds is actually, well, everything that I'm sharing with my employer and whatever they're doing that is in no way worse than what's happening with my personal data in my personal life. And that's not to say that I believe that's the right thing at all. I absolutely think there needs to be ethics on both sides of the fence, and that second problem is a far more complex one that probably needs a lot more than an hour. And I'm sure Mr. Kirchschläger has lots of views on that one. But from a business perspective, yeah, I think we're almost desensitized to it. So we take it for granted. And I'm not sure many employees actually even ask the question of what happens with my data. You just, from a business perspective, you just assume my employees ask for it, fine, I'll fill it in. And they don't really take that into account, which is worrying in some respects.
Yes, good point. And as you mentioned, these are issues that need a lot more than just an hour to discuss. So as my last question, I would take a big leap forward, and I would like to know, also somebody from the audience would like to know, how do we use data in 15 years? How is recruiting going to look? Maybe Mr. Patel can elaborate a little bit on that, and maybe Mr. Kirchschläger can elaborate on how he thinks in 15 years data analytics will be used or misused.
Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think when we look at recruitment specifically, and to go back to something we spoke about right at the beginning of the Q&A, I said sort of not at the moment in terms of is a person actually making that final decision. it almost seems inevitably that the way we're moving is more and more automation and more reliance on technology to help us make decisions. And that's not necessarily removing people from the process completely, but I think what it is doing is it's trying to make processes more efficient. So in the future, recruitment might look a lot more like, actually, we're using a lot of that public information that's already out there about you. So we don't need you to apply for a job because we can trawl the internet. We can find, using LinkedIn, using various other sources, who are the best candidates for the job. We can reach out to them, target them specifically, get them to apply for a job with us if they're interested. And then maybe we fast track them through the process because we've got AI telling us that, we found this person for you on the internet. They're a great match. Let's hire them. So I think that's probably where it's going. It's broadening the pool of talent we're looking at and using it to help us find people. And then also making incremental gains in that whole efficiency piece and in terms of our recruitment processes in general.
Mr. Kirchschläger?
I think in order to enable us to have a future in 15 years, which is enjoyable for humans, where human rights and human dignity are respected of all humans, and we still have like an environment where we can live. So we also have like sustainability and environment protection in place. I think we have to stop business models which at their core have human rights violations. So what Mr. Patel was describing before, and very precisely about, our personal spheres, our personal life, where we are generating data all the time, like data is collected and data is used in order to then manipulate us in our political decision-making processes, but also in our choices as consumers. I think these are not like negative side effects of these businesses. It's rather, it's at the core of these business models in order to collect as much data as possible and then sell it to the one who gives the more for it, pays the more for it. And so it's at the heart of these business models are actually violations of like the human right to privacy and the human right to data protection. And we have to fix this. I mean, like the Facebook case, thanks to the whistleblower now getting more like public and political interest. It's just an example of business models which actually in their core are violating human rights. And that's, I think we absolutely need to stop that in order to have a future which is enjoyable. And then on the other hand, I think on an institutional level, I would call for the funding of a database systems agency, an international database systems agency, which is kind of coordinating, on an international global level, how we deal with database systems. Because if one country is doing something and the other country doesn't, then it will be difficult for the one country who's doing something about these issues. So I think we need to have a global coordinated effort in mastering these ethical challenges we face in the framework of digital transformation database systems. I think here in an analogy to the nuclear technologies, there humanity did research, created a bomb, unfortunately dropped the bomb, and then humanity understood that we need to do something about it on a global level in order to make sure that something worse doesn't happen. I'm aware of the fact that this is not a perfect solution. I'm aware of the geopolitical implications the solution we have right now is having, but still it helped us to not run into another worse situation and so forth. So I would call for a similar agency at the UN for database systems, because the risk is similar. That's not just me as an ethicist saying that, but also someone like Elon Musk, who's definitely someone who is totally happy about technology-based progress, is saying that like AI used in the wrong way can be more dangerous than nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. This is definitely a good point that no country can solve this problem for itself. It needs, and also no business can solve this problem for itself. It needs a global approach to how we want to proceed and how we want to use data in the future. So thank you very much to Rickesh Patel and Peter Kirchschläger for this interesting and lively discussion. The next installment of the series will be Thursday, again at 4 p.m. It will be about how data-driven finance can help companies to become more efficient and smarter. Again, it's going to be me as your host. So I wish you a nice afternoon and thank you for listening. Goodbye.